It was around 9:30 p.m. on a Friday night. I was at home, sitting comfortably in my favorite chair, attempting to read a book. Earlier, my wife Terry had called to say she needed to stay late at work. That wasn't unusual, but the second call was different. She said what she needed to say and I responded with a firm, unwavering hell no. Not just any no, a final, definitive refusal. I told her there was a diamond cab parked in lot number 27, and she had exactly 30 minutes to be home. The ride from her office would take 25. If she didn't make it, she could ask the driver to take her to her mother's place instead. She didn't argue, didn't even try to explain herself. Just sighed, a long drawn-out breath of something between frustration and resignation. I hung up, disconnected the phone and powered off my cell. I tried to focus on my book, but my mind was elsewhere. 29 minutes and 30 seconds later, I stood up and walked toward the door, ready to lock it for the night. Just as my hand reached for the bolt, headlights swept across the driveway. A cab rolled in, slow, almost deliberate. I watched as Terry stepped out, her posture tense, her words sharp as she berated the driver. Something about how she could have walked home faster. I met the driver's eyes, handed him a $25 tip, and exchanged a knowing smile before he drove away. Terry stormed past me, slamming the door behind her. She locked it, secured the chain, and disappeared inside without a word. I didn't follow. Instead, I took a seat in my rocking chair on the porch, reached for a cold beer from the cooler beside me and waited. And waited. When I finished the beer and she still hadn't come back outside, I climbed into my work truck, turned on the CD player and locked the doors. I reclined the seat, cracked the windows just enough to keep the air from getting stale, and settled in for the night. Let me introduce myself. I'm George Rout, though the Gene is silent. My friends call me Grow. My wife Terry hates nicknames. She won't let anyone call her Trout, though I think it suits her just fine. I'm a master plumber. She works as a secretary in a small office. By the time morning rolled around, I was still in the truck. Terry apparently had spent a good 45 minutes looking for me. When she finally found me, she was still wearing the same clothes she'd had on the night before. My guess? It had something to do with the fact that our bedroom door was locked. And maybe because all of her clothes were packed in garbage bags and locked in the back of my truck. She screamed at me for a while, but I let her. When she finally stopped, winded and furious, she caught the smirk on my face. And then she realized, the neighbors were watching. I grinned and walked back inside. Opened the fridge. Reached for another beer. Then changed my mind. No need to dim my brain cells just yet. Instead, I grabbed a Diet Coke, cracked it open and took a slow sip. As if on cue, the song Flower of Scotland began playing from the truck's CD player. I turned up the volume. There's something about the wail of bagpipes that soothes me. Terry stalked past me, retreating inside, and left the door wide open. I didn't move until the song ended. Only then did I follow her in, shutting the door behind me. She sat at one end of the couch, arms crossed, face set like stone. I didn't acknowledge her. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and found the bag of donuts I'd left on the counter the night before. Terry hates donuts. I ate too. Slowly. It took her a while to join me. When she did, I pushed the bag toward her in an offer. The look she gave me would have killed a lesser man. I smirked, tilting my head, watching her the way a dog does when it knows it has the upper hand. Finally she spoke. How did you know where I was last night? I didn't hesitate. You told me? Her expression was priceless. I never said a word about it, she insisted. I shrugged. Would you believe you talk in your sleep? Silence. I leaned back, studying her. The first time you and James just held hands. She paled. The second time you let him touch your leg. Her breath hitched. The last time you kissed him for 12 minutes in a parking lot before coming home. Do you want me to go on? She didn't. Instead, she whispered, no. Her voice was small. Hollow. She shook her head, eyes unfocused. I still don't understand why I did it. I didn't answer. I don't even know why I called him last night, why I asked if I could stay over. That one stung. Was that what you really wanted? I asked, voice steady. Because if it was, I'd rather you just file for divorce and enjoy yourself. No, she said immediately. No, I don't want that. Her eyes glistened. I love you too much to go through with that. I don't know what I was thinking, but I don't want to lose you. I want to stay married to you for the rest of my life. We talked for another hour. She kept saying she didn't know why she had done it. That she only loved me. That she wanted to fix things. I told her I still loved her too. But love doesn't erase betrayal. And trust? Trust had been badly damaged. I needed time. She asked if she could go upstairs, take a bath, and change. I leaned back in my chair. Where did you sleep last night? The guest room, she admitted softly. Good, I said. That's where you'll be staying for the foreseeable future. The shock on her face would have been almost amusing if the situation weren't so raw. If the back of my truck isn't cleaned out by Monday morning, I'll take your things to your mother's house. I met her gaze, my voice calm but firm. And don't make a mess in the truck. Her eyes flashed. I'm not sleeping in that room. I'm your wife. I cut her off. You're very close to being my ex-wife, I said evenly. Tears welled up. I didn't move. I watched her crumble, her breath hitching between sobs, but I didn't take the words back. Eventually she asked if she could at least get her things out of the truck. I didn't answer right away. I sat there staring at the locks, considering. After a moment I decided it could wait. She followed my gaze. You don't need to install those, she murmured. I didn't respond. Instead I grabbed another donut. Then went out back to check on Buttercup. Buttercup is my dog. Part Mastiff, part Irish Wolfhound. At 275 pounds and 6 feet 8 inches on his hind legs, he's not the most graceful thing in the world. But when it comes to loyalty, he and I see eye to eye. Buttercup was my baby. Sure, at 275 pounds and standing 6 feet 8 inches on his hind legs, he didn't look like a baby, but next to me he was as sweet as could be. Unless, of course, you messed with me. Or my house. Or my truck. I'd seen firsthand what he did to a man who thought he needed my tools more than I did. The guy had begged the police to take him away, trembling and nearly in tears, though the worst of it wasn't Buttercup pinning him down, it was when my puppy farted right in his face. That poor bastard stayed there, frozen, until I finally called Buttercup off. The cops? They just laughed as they hauled him away. Buttercup and I had even gone to guard dog training together. He was trained to stay hidden until the first item left my truck, and then? He moved fast. I had been sitting outside watching the evening fade into night, when I heard the door slam. Terry stormed out into the yard, her anger barely restrained as she came looking for me. Her voice rose in a furious yell, until a low, dangerous growl from behind froze her in place. She hadn't even heard Buttercup move. He lay down at my feet, calm and silent once more, and shut his eyes as if he hadn't just threatened to tear her apart. Terry's voice was softer now, almost hesitant. Can you unlock the truck? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the keys and twisted them between my fingers, letting the moment stretch. Finally, I unlocked it. She walked over, grabbed the first bag and carried it inside. That's when I dumped the rest of her things on the ground. In 5 minutes, the sprinklers will turn on, I said, casually brushing dust off my jeans. Her eyes widened. She scrambled to grab her clothes, her movements frantic as she tried to beat the inevitable. I watched, smirking as she bent down for the second-to-last bag. Then the sprinklers came to life. Water shot into the air, drenching her instantly. She gasped, clutching the last bag to her chest, trying to sprint out of the spray, but it was no use. By the time she made it inside, she was soaked from head to toe. I grinned and reached down, giving Buttercup a slow, affectionate pat. Later that evening, as she ironed her work clothes, her phone rang. Her voice was low, urgent, apologetic. I could hear every word. I'm sorry I left the restaurant without saying anything. She hesitated. I had to go. He found out. Silence. Then a voice on the other end, James. I couldn't make out his words, but I could hear the frustration, the insistence, the growing anger. Terry's voice wavered. No, I can't see you anymore. James' voice rose, louder, more persistent. She hung up. Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. She stared at it for a second. Then, without hesitation, she turned it off. I decided it was time to explain a few things. 6 years ago, on our honeymoon, Terry and I had gone to a magic show. One of the acts involved a hypnotist who called her, along with 3 other women, up onto the stage. He put them under, made them do all kinds of ridiculous things, and when he was finished he returned her to me in the audience. But before he let her go, he leaned in close and whispered a special phrase in my ear. He told me that if I ever said those words again, Terry would instantly be under hypnosis. Completely under my control, and no one else's. Of course, she didn't remember a thing. The first words out of her mouth when she'd woke up were, I told you, you couldn't hypnotize me. The audience had laughed. That night, out of pure curiosity, I had whispered the phrase again. And sure enough, her will dissolved like sugar in water. So I gave her a simple command. Never let anyone touch your breasts or genitals without my permission. She obeyed. For years, I never had a reason to use the phrase again. Until a few weeks ago. When Terry suddenly started working late on Fridays. At first I brushed it off. But something didn't sit right. So one night, I waited until she fell asleep, whispered the phrase and asked her. And she told me everything. Without hesitation. She told me about James. She told me about the dates. The touches. The kisses. She thought James was just a salesman. But James worked for a company owned by a close friend of mine. And his boss, Roger, had been looking for an excuse to fire him for years. See, James was lazy. Did the bare minimum to keep his job. Worse than that, he'd been scamming the company, inflating his expense reports, passing off the cost of his dates as business meetings. But until Terry, there was no proof. Roger was determined to catch him. He demanded that James provide client contact information for each of those supposed meetings. If James couldn't, he was done. To make things worse, Terry's company phone had GPS tracking. I knew exactly where she was every time she met James. And the cab driver that brought her home? That was Paul's son, my best friend's kid. On Monday, James was called into Roger's office. He was given 24 hours to provide proof that those expense reports were legitimate. He failed. He was fired. Poor James didn't take it well. He had been angry about being dumped. Thought he was making progress with Terry. So he snapped. One evening after work, I watched from a distance as James grabbed her, shoved her into his car. Terry fought him, thrashing wildly in the passenger seat. But James was bigger, stronger. He hit her once, hard, and that was all it took. Her body slumped. He sped south, heading toward the seediest part of town, where a rundown motel stood, a place so vile it defied description. He wasn't alone. 3 more men were waiting. I already had allies stationed nearby, including Paul, who was at that very motel. I followed at a safe distance, watching as they pulled into the parking lot. Paul sent me a quick confirmation they were inside. I parked around the corner, out of sight. Buttercup and I got out. We approached the room. I knocked. One of James' lackeys cracked the door open, secured by a chain. I didn't hesitate. With a forceful kick, I sent the door flying inward. Buttercup lunged past me. The only command I gave him was simple. Protect Terry. I turned to James' men, 2 of them standing by the bed. Buttercup went for James. The sight of him was anything but pleasant. Buttercup lunged for James's most vulnerable area, moving with the silent precision of a predator. At the same time, I turned my attention to the 2 other men, slamming them against the wall with such force that the cheap motel drywall cracked beneath them. They fought back, but they were no match. A single, piercing scream cut through the room, momentarily freezing everyone, except me. I seized both men by their arms and twisted sharply, the sickening pop of dislocated shoulders echoing in the tight space. A flurry of calculated strikes left them with shattered jaws, concussions, and labored, ragged breaths. Glancing toward the door, I saw the first assailant sprawled unconscious beneath it, the same door I had torn from its hinges moments earlier. James lay on the floor, his body curled inward, eyes rolled back in shock. He wasn't just unconscious, he was ruined. Buttercup sat beside him, gnawing contentedly on his newfound prize. I gave a single command. Drop it. Buttercup obeyed, releasing the remnants onto the cold floor. James would never reclaim what had been lost. Terry lay unconscious on the bed, her clothes torn and disheveled, her face bruised from the struggle. I moved toward her, pulling a blanket over her body just as the distant wail of sirens reached my ears. Buttercup and I stepped back into the shadows, away from the chaos. At my signal, he lay down, covering his eyes with his massive paws, an old trick we had practiced many times. The police burst into the room, weapons raised, only to find me standing with my hands in the air and Buttercup lying calmly beside me. One officer, who had witnessed Buttercup's ferocity in the past, struggled to contain his laughter at the bizarre scene before him. I wasted no time explaining. The woman on the bed is my wife. She was kidnapped near her workplace earlier today and I tracked them here. Their eyes flicked toward the bloody remains on the floor. As for that, it belonged to the kidnapper. The other 3? I have no idea who they are. The officers exchanged looks. Witnesses on the street had already reported the abduction, prompting an active search for the vehicle. My presence was no surprise, they had been looking for her. Terry stirred, panic flooding her eyes as she struggled to orient herself. Her breathing was shallow, frantic. She was ready to lash out at anyone who came near. Buttercup was beside her in an instant, leaping onto the bed in 2 powerful strides, his heavy paws pressing into the mattress as he towered over her. Terry swung at him, still lost in the haze of fear. Buttercup didn't flinch. Instead, he gently licked her face, his warm breath washing over her bruised skin. The tension in her shoulders eased. Her breathing slowed. I stepped forward. The officers made a move toward her, but Buttercup's deep, threatening growl froze them in place. I reassured him, telling him they meant no harm. Slowly he relaxed, though the officers wisely kept their distance. The ambulances arrived. Terry was the first to be loaded in, still clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Attempts were made to tend to James, but he had lost too much blood. His body was already cold. One of the paramedics stepped on something soft. He glanced down, realized what it was, and immediately wretched. The two men I had injured were next, moaning weakly as they were lifted onto stretchers. The one I had knocked unconscious beneath the door suffered only minor injuries and was arrested on the spot. An officer pulled me aside, delivering a stern warning about taking matters into my own hands. But none of them pressed charges. No one wanted to test their luck with Buttercup watching. Once the ordeal was over, we headed home. A few minutes after I changed into something more presentable, the doorbell rang. It was the pizza I had ordered. Buttercup's favorite, a small pie with extra cheese, beef, and green peppers. He was ecstatic. At the hospital, Terry was awake and insistent on seeing me. Her injuries weren't severe: sore muscles, a mild concussion, and a badly bruised jaw. But as a precaution, the doctors kept her under observation for 36 hours. Meanwhile, all three accomplices were charged with multiple felonies. The two men who resisted arrest would never fully recover. Paul and I, along with the officers, testified in court. The sentences were harsh: 15 to 30 years. James was buried in his hometown, though his wife didn't even attend the funeral. Buttercup, however, was honored. The state troopers made him an honorary officer, a title that changed everything between him and Terry. Before, she had been too afraid to have him inside the house. Now he had his own bedroom. A 4-poster bed. A custom mattress. His name engraved in gold on the door. The only time he was apart from Terry was when he rode with me to work. And then we found him a companion. A rugged, equally massive female. Soon after, she became pregnant with their first litter. Terry took time to heal, physically and emotionally, but eventually she returned to our bedroom and life settled into a comfortable rhythm. 25 years passed. So much had changed. My boss retired, selling the entire company to me for a generous sum and a small percentage of profits until his passing. Terry and I had 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. The boys took after me. The girls were nearly 6 feet tall, favoring Terry in both looks and personality. Buttercup lived a full 12 years, and when he finally passed, his companion followed not long after, heartbroken without him. But his legacy lived on. Through careful breeding and training, we now had 4 of his grandchildren and 1 of his sons living with us. Each one was just as massive, just as fierce, and just as loving. The boys were named Tiny and Baby. The girls? Minnie and Petunia. Even my employees had started training their own dogs. Each of our plumbing trucks now bore a painted image of Buttercup, his massive form standing as a symbol of loyalty, protection, and strength. And with that, we renamed the company Best Friend Plumbing. Business thrived. Terry and I remained inseparable, our bond forged in hardship and strengthened through love. We built a life together, one that neither of us ever took for granted. And yes, after all these years, I still kept those locks in the garage. Terry knew they were there. A quiet reminder of the past we had overcome.